New protests are erupting in Egypt. Let's get the latest details on that, as well as the rest of the world and national news in D.C.
All right,
Elaine.
thanks, Michelle. There have been a number of clashes in several Egyptian cities between supporters and opponents of ousted President Mohamed Morsi. A number of people have died in Friday's violence. CCTV's Adel El Mahrouky joins us live from Cairo. And Adel, what's the latest there from the capital?
Well, the clashes are continuing in about 4 cities in Egypt. The main clashes and the highest number of casualties is in both the northern coastal city of Alexandria and the city of Tanta at the center of Delta North Cairo. So far, officially at least 42 have been injured in Tanta alone. The death toll is around 6 to 8 people, and we expect that the numbers will rise because the protests are actually continuing. And this comes since a long day today and Friday. Many had the fears that when we have both sides, the pro-Morsi and the pro-army protesters rallying at the same time, it could lead to these clashes. The day was immense and it reflected how Egypt was divided. Let's take a look.
Thousands of pro-Morsi protesters rallied to Rabaa Square and other parts of Egypt as the standoff with the military continued. Their protests came as it emerged that Morsi is set to be detained for 15 days on allegations of espionage that involves Hamas. This is the first time the ousted president is facing numerous charges, but his supporters are not giving up.
They think that the case against Morsi will stop us. They tried to send thugs to attack us. That didn't work as well. The only thing that will make us stop is Morsi's return.
Moving from their isolation at Rabaa Al Square, the armed forces stand among protesters here at the presidential palace, where thousands came to respond to Defense Minister Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's calls to support the army against terrorism.
It was like a celebration there. Colored lights decorated the street and army officers distributed gifts. But bloody clashes could erupt at any moment if opposing rallies cross.
This is not a green card to the army to do what they wish against anyone. This is a message to those who want to use violence that we want to live in security like the old times. So if they continue, the army must take action.
There is no terrorism here. The terrorism is what Sisi has called for. To be delegated from the people to fight terrorism, it is his duty. But the terror he means is against the Muslim Brotherhood and the peaceful protesters.
Clashes have been already reported in some parts in Cairo between Morsi supporters and the armies. It is a decisive day for Egypt. The numbers of protesters supporting either side will be compared to determine who has the majority.
The protests are still continuing here in Tahrir Square. It is also celebrational, exactly as at the presidential palace, where army supporters have taken the streets. It's about 2:30 o'clock in the morning here in Egypt, and it doesn't seem that these protesters will go home soon. The same goes for Rabaa Al Square, where the pro-Morsi supporters have been sitting in for quite a long time. And in a speech from the interim president, he said he urged the protesters to go back home.
All right, CCTV's Adel El Mahrouky, a very familiar scene there again in Tahrir Square. Thank you so much. U.S. reaction to the crisis in Egypt is in the spotlight. Washington is concerned about the escalating violence in the country, as well as the criminal accusations leveled at deposed President Mohamed Morsi, but it still has not entirely cut off aid. Joining us now is CCTV's Nathan King to take us through Washington's reaction to these unfolding events in Cairo.
Elaine, is it a coup or not a coup? That question has preoccupied Washington for weeks, and not without reason. Under the Foreign Assistance Act of the U.S., the act says there can be no aid, quote, to any country whose duly elected head of government is deposed by a military coup. And it can only be restored when, quote, a democratically elected government has taken office. That means if designated a coup, the nearly $1.5 billion a year the U.S. supplies in mainly Egyptian military aid would have to be suspended. Well, on Friday, the U.S. State Department said it's simply not making a determination on whether a military coup took place or not, which avoids the US from having been forced to cut off aid.
The law does not require us to make a formal determination. That is a review that we have undergone as to whether a coup took place, and it is not in our national interest to make such a determination.
This legal reasoning affected by national interest means the US can continue to send aid, though it is doing so more and more on a case-by-case basis. Remember Wednesday when the Pentagon announced it is delaying delivery of 4 F-16 fighter jets, and the Egyptians have already paid for those. They're doing this due to the situation on the ground. As for Mohamed Morsi, the US is continuing to call for his release, even after allegations of criminal wrongdoing.
Well, we, of course, are deeply concerned by reports that an Egyptian court has ordered the detention of Mr. Morsi. I can't speak to the specific charges, but we do believe that it is important that there be a process to work towards his release. Clearly, this process should respect the personal security of him and take into account the volatile political situation in Egypt, and that's where our focus is.
Notice the use of the word Mr. Morsi, not President. Washington is choosing its words very carefully over Egypt. One Muslim Brotherhood official has accused the US of using verbal acrobatics. Given Washington's national security interest, ties to the Egyptian military, and calls for a rapid return to democracy, we can expect more difficult days ahead for US diplomacy, Elaine.
All right, thanks for that update, Nathan King. For a closer look at the immediate future of Egypt, I spoke with David Adelman, editor of the World Policy Journal, and I asked him if these latest protests will postpone the political process there.
Well, the biggest problem right now is that the Muslim Brotherhood is the only really organized political party, political entity in Egypt. They're the only ones capable of turning out a vote. So the question is, even if they had an election in the timeline that the military has been talking about, what kind of an election would that be? That was the problem the last time. You had a fragmentation of the non-Muslim Brotherhood political spectrum, and then you had the Brotherhood. So that even if you have a two-round contest, that is to say the top two people in the second round, you have the Brotherhood inevitably, and another candidate around which all of the rest of the country has to crystallize. So it's not clear that we wouldn't be right back in the same problem again with a Brotherhood candidate. And that's what right now has everybody in a quandary. What kind of mechanism do you put in that will get the Brotherhood out and a really legitimate democratic kind of candidate in as president?
Let's turn to the Egyptian army now and its general. Do you think they're hindering the process of the country coming together by calling for these protests?
I don't think there was any alternative. I think the military had to come in some fashion. I don't think the military is engineering protests at all. I think the protests are really coming from the people. I think the people on both sides, obviously the Brotherhood is engineering protests of its own, but the other side, the Democratic side, they don't need an engineer. They need people simply to go into the streets with an ideology, with a concept of democracy, and I think that's what we're seeing right now.
It's been about a month now since Mohamed Morsi was pushed out of office, so to speak. The longer we see this instability, what kind of message do you think it's sending around the world about democracy in Egypt, especially democracy in that region overall?
Well, democracy in the region overall is a particularly interesting question because now what's happening in Syria? Syria, they're talking about partitioning the country, possibly, or ad infinitum. So we might eventually have a rump Assad Syria and a rump, opposition, a democratic Syria. You can't really have that in Egypt. Egypt is really such an amorphous country. It's a vast country. It's a very large country. And its population is divided even within neighborhoods between these two sides, between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Democratic side. And also, by the way, some who would really like to see the return of some kind of a Mubarak-style dictatorship, probably. I don't think the military really wants that. I think they've moved past that. I think they now understand that the power really has to be returned to the people, but it really has to be a democratic power, not a kind of government that's going to come in like the Brotherhood did and was more concerned about perpetuating the Brotherhood in office rather than simply fixing up the ills of this really very seriously traumatized country.
Well, if you could look down the line a year from now, what do you see in Egypt?
Well, I hope we'll see stability. I hope we'll have some kind of an election behind us at that point, and an election that really will have some kind of a democratic process. The biggest problem right now is how to, A, contain the Brotherhood, and B, put together some kind of a coherent opposition to the Brotherhood that can really energize the Egyptian people and bring them out to the polls and vote for a democratic Egypt. That would be the ideal. What may ultimately happen is we have a succession of crises like this, and that would be the worst possible thing because the economy will stagnate, the economy will never really get going again, and the people will be, well, more and more people will be starving, frankly.
And what happens to Mohamed Morsi now? There's been talk of him recently, but where do you see him? Do you see him falling by the wayside in all of this?
I think pretty much. I mean, the latest that we hear from Egypt is he's now being investigated for this prison break a short time ago, a couple of years ago, actually. And what happened there was very clearly the Brotherhood engineered their being broken out of prison. But the process that's going on now against him is a way of legitimizing the seizure of power by the military and his overthrow. So I think in some fashion they're going to have to either bring some kind of charges against him, or they're going to have to simply find a way of keeping him quiet. Because every appearance by him, if there is a future appearance by him, will only energize the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's something that really neither the country nor the military especially, certainly not the democratic elements, can afford.
All right, David Andelman, we appreciate your time and your perspective. Thank you so much for joining us from New York.
Thanks for having me.